Gender equity to me is, in a form, a level playing field. So that usually means equal opportunity in terms of standards of employment, chance of employment, and pay once a person is employed. Absolutely, although maybe not a way in which people expect. So I think a lot of leadership positions, jobs, are generally perceived as being dominated by males, but I think Bendigo, and certainly from what I've seen, there is a very interesting dynamic wherein a lot of the leadership or the leaders that I see in Bendigo are actually female, and certainly some of the more influential ones in Bendigo. I think one of the ones that stands out to me came out from quite a, I think, interesting situation. So not too long ago, there was a bit of a crisis in Bendigo education system. A principal got ousted from a school, and then another teacher had to be sent in from a senior secondary school. I was at the time a student at the senior secondary school, and a female principal, assistant principal, stood up to take the principal role in that place as an acting principal. And I would have to say that that was probably one of the best years that that school has seen. She was a fantastic acting principal, brought about some really wonderful change to the school itself, and in terms of staff morale, because I'm quite close to someone who works there, she made the school a really welcoming and quite positive place to actually work in. She cared about the staff, she cared about what she was doing as a principal, and was passionate about that, and genuinely cared for the students that she was essentially supervising. Advertising how, or better communicating the role that anyone can play in an industry that perhaps they're not usually involved in. I think one of the best examples of sort of a negative spin around this is someone like Renee Gracie. So she's a female touring car driver in Australia, and she's raced at Bathurst multiple times. However, in those times, she's not necessarily been successful in the general sense, and that's where a lot of that attention has gone, unfortunately. Not towards the fact that she's actually made it to that point, and not in the fact that she's gotten there in what is otherwise a very male-dominated field. And I think that is a bit of a shame. One of the good things I've seen as well in that sort of gender equity area is how well people have taken to AFLW. So traditional kind of thing, Australian rules football, very male dominated. But if you look at how well received AFLW has been, and how quickly it's caught on with the general public and the sporting public, that shows that we are hopefully looking forward to some really dramatic and positive change. Yeah, look, absolutely. One of the key things that I tell people when I talk about sort of employment and opportunity is earlier this year I was studying in Melbourne, still living here, however, and commuting down there. That made my employment opportunities very slim. Decided to kind of leave that behind for a little while and take a leave of absence. So when I did that, I started looking for employment opportunities. Now, I've got a background in retail, specifically fashion retail, clothing, menswear, that kind of thing. And I'd held a job before, and there were some unfortunate circumstances around that. So I was kind of back in the field. I applied at maybe 10 places around Bendigo, And I'd have to say I probably didn't hear back from any of them. And unfortunately, I think that was because they were looking for a kind of certain demographic to hire. And I would be so bold to say that that was probably a young female, approachable, friendly, bright, maybe not somebody that is necessarily myself, let's say. You know, sometimes they're not looking for that kind of 19, 20, 21-year-old male who wants to sell suits or jumpers to other males. I think that doesn't quite fit the ideal of what a, say, clothing or fashion retail worker is. Apart from, yeah, the whole retail, clothing retail business, I'd say even just throughout school, I've found that you kind of tend to miss out on certain leadership opportunities, or you aren't necessarily considered for, things like those leadership opportunities. Theatre as well, music theatre is generally considered a very female-dominated place, and I've noticed a trend towards that in the public speaking and debating field as well. So a lot of really strong young females coming through that, sharing strong points. And while that is a good thing, I think that's something that schools tend to look for a little too much, whether that be because they just think that young males aren't interested, they'd rather be playing sport or whatever that may be. I've found that that is a trend that is popping up, and as a result, I think I've missed out on opportunities like that during my schooling, where I really would have liked to have that chance and, say, be that person behind that lectern. Quite possibly. I'm a fairly visually and aesthetically driven person, so I think if I hadn't have been exposed to a certain stigma of what I should be doing as a person, maybe I could have branched out into, say, a kind of fashion design field, gone into theatre, gone into art, or even journalism. I think in the journalism field, there's a certain perception that male journalists can be a bit frightening, a bit intense, because you get those kind of hardball interviewers. And that's not necessarily the person I would have wanted to be, and I think that could have been a missed opportunity and something that, I wouldn't have been fortunate to be a part of. Aside from the female principal that I was talking about, acting principal, Linda Lyons, brilliant woman, I would have to say someone like Michelle Mouton. So she was a French racing driver during the 80s, which was the kind of peak of what was called Group B. She was a test driver for Audi at the time, when they were really very influential to the racing scene. And her success and her influence wasn't really very well advertised at all. And I think that is really a shame, because she was one of the pioneer women in motorsport, and that's simply massive, really. Other than that, I'd probably have to say Julia Gillard. As divisive as that is to some people, I think it's fair. She was the first female Prime Minister. She stood her ground despite a lot of flack, and then eventually, I think, got undermined, and I think that was a shame for Australia's first female Prime Minister. Total gender equity in Bendigo. I think we'd have a really interesting shift in dynamic and how Bendigo interacts as a city, I think it could be a far more interesting and perhaps metropolitan place. So I think already we're doing a great job with people like our Mayor, Margaret O'Rourke. You know, you kind of see parallels between her and the Lord Mayor of Melbourne, Sally Capp. I think in terms of kind of women in leadership, we're doing a great job. I'd love to see kind of more women in those less celebrated fields, having some influence, having some push, but then seeing men feel like they're being comfortable to kind of push in those directions where maybe we haven't seen them go before. Places like modelling at the Bendigo Fashion Festival, which I did, I think, last year as part of one of my previous jobs. Things like that where we can be inclusive and be equitous and really push that boundary to be a more equal and accepting community, because we're a big city, but I think in the grand scheme of things, we're still a small city as well. So we really need to be understanding what we are as a community and pushing towards something that is more inclusive, I think.